morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. This morning, we are blessed to have with us the Reverend Tim Cargal, who will be leading us in today's webinar. I will ask our transitional leader, Reverend Sandana Gallman-Ashley, to do a proper introduction, but welcome everyone. Please put your questions in the chat and we will get to them as needed, okay, as possible. All right, Sandana?
Well, good morning. We are happy that you're here for CPM Part 2. And today we have the pleasure of having Tim Cargal, who's the manager for the preparation process in the Office of the General Assembly. He is also an assistant stated clerk and his bio is online. What I can say to you is that if there's anything you want to know about the preparation process, Tim Cargal is your resource for that information. We're so happy that he's here with us to talk to us about exams and alternative means. As we get started, again, we ask that you will remain on mute. And when you can, please stay on camera. This session will be recorded for future use. And so at this time, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and brother, Tim Cargal. Thank you, Tim.
It's good to be with you all again this morning. My name is racing to the other things that I will be doing today, but good to be with you all this morning. You know, get in like kind of zen and into the moment here with you all. We are going to be talking this morning about ordination exams from the viewpoint of a committee on preparation or a commission that is overseeing candidates. And so talking about how the process works, how you can utilize that information, and when it may be times that those necessary assessments of competencies will need to be done in a different way. As Lori mentioned, we would encourage you to put any questions that you have into chat. Also, if you have a question, you can use a raise hand function, but generally speaking, these meetings, just because it's easier to do the handoff on the sound and all of those kind of things, if you can just go ahead and put it in chat, I'll be keeping an eye on that as we go through and try to answer those questions. If I see a question in chat and I know I'm going to get to it in the next couple of minutes, I may just kind of ignore it for a moment and we'll come to it. So don't panic, or as we say when we're doing these webinars for ordination exam readers, if you already know you've got a question before I even say anything on this topic, just go ahead and put that in the chat at any time and we'll keep tabs on it and be sure that we answer your questions this morning. I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you this morning, so let me get that started. So again, we're going to be talking about ordination exams, again, from the viewpoint of our CPMs and what the things are that you need to know as you're thinking about the ordination exams and working with your inquirers and candidates about this part of the preparation process. The ordination exams began in a period when there was a loss of trust. In the 1950s and 60s, there was a sense that there was a growing disparity in the qualifications and the preparation that people were demonstrating when they enter into ministry with the church. And it was demonstrated in a couple of different ways. In one way, it was demonstrated by some folks who were highly qualified, but because they didn't come from the traditional groups or they didn't have the connections in the presbyteries, their qualifications were not being taken seriously or not being warranted as they should have been. In other cases, there were folks who were very well connected, who may not really have had the competencies, but because of their connections, they were getting through. And so the General Assembly decided that they needed to provide a more equitable standard of expectation among all the presbyteries. So in 1964, they passed an overture in the United Presbyterian Church, the Northern Church, to explore the possibilities of giving and creating a set of standard ordination exams that would set a kind of baseline sense of competency, so that when the person came to be ordained, or excuse me, came to be examined on the floor of the presbytery for ordination, there really was, again, that baseline assumption of competency. And so that in that ordination, there would have to be some reason that would come out through that for saying that this person was not prepared and ready to begin the responsibilities of the minister of word and sacrament. We still have the ordination exams, and in part it really is about this lack of a sense of trust, though the reasons have shifted a little bit. One of the reasons that we now have this kind of lack of trust is that presbyteries are now tend to be more concerned that maybe some of their colleagues have not been as willing as they ought to be to say to some persons who are in the process, you're definitely called to ministry. We know that everyone, as we talked about the last time we were together, everyone is called to ministry and gifted for ministry in their baptism. But not everybody is called to the ministry of the word and sacrament. And so presbyteries, sometimes they get some experiences with folks who are in first calls who don't really seem to have the gifts and the preparation that are necessary. And so there is then this sense that some presbyteries may not be as rigorous as perhaps they should be. And there's also a sense that, particularly now that the form of government, again, as we talked about last time, has a very, very narrow set of requirements that are really focused on outcomes of preparation, that some presbyteries are concerned that not everybody is requiring enough of their candidates. And so the ordination exams continue then to provide a kind of baseline assessment of the competencies that the church is looking for within the preparation for ministry process. Now, we provide from the Office of the General Assembly, working with the Presbytery's Cooperative Committee on Examinations for Candidates, that sets all of the policies regarding the exams and writes the exams, resources the readers, and so forth. We work with them to prepare a variety of resources that are available to you as members of the committee and also to your inquirers and candidates around these ordination exams. The most comprehensive resource that we have is the Handbook on Standard Ordination Examinations. It is over 100 pages long, and it is not designed to be set down and read from front to back. There's a fair bit of repetition in sections of it, because it really is designed to be more like an encyclopedia, if you will, so that when you have a specific question, and some of those questions can be very specific, like if I'm taking the Greek or Hebrew exam, how do I input Greek or Hebrew in my response? Then you can go to the handbook and you can find that information. So the handbook covers everything from registration all the way through your review with candidates about their results, and even considering when there may be occasions that appeals may need to be filed. Together with the handbook, we also provide on the Equip website of the denomination 2 training resources, online training resources, one that's focused specifically on the Bible content exam and provides some guidance as to what the purposes of that exam are, some tips on how to prepare for that exam, and then an archive of questions that have been used on the exam in the past, so that inquirers and candidates can have a sense of the types of questions that are used on the exam. There's also a whole section just on the senior ordination exams, on Bible exegesis, church polity, theological competence, and worship and sacraments. Again, very similar structure, some preparation guidelines, descriptions of them, and then also some archives of recent exams so that they have examples of the types of questions that will be asked. There are other resources, online resources, that are available as part of those courses, including some videos about understanding what the exams are assessing, some tips on taking the exams and answering the questions that are presented. So a lot of resources that are there and available to your inquirers and candidates. They have access to that once you've enrolled them as an inquirer. I'll say more about that in just a moment. But the same account that they would use to register for exams gives them access to these resources. And you, as members of the CPM, You also have access to these courses in a little different way. Actually, anyone can go to equip.pcusa.org, which is an online training site covering a lot of resources, things for ruling elders, a lot of different things. And in the section of self-enrollment courses, you'll see a heading on that homepage for ordination exam preparation. So you too can go there, you can click those links, and you can get direct access into these courses and materials as well. So I mentioned the online registration process. The presbytery is responsible for creating the user accounts that inquirers and candidates need in order to register to take the exams. You do that by registering them as inquirers or candidates under your care. So when you go to the p4m.pcusa.org site, where you have all the information about your inquirers and candidates, whenever you go there and you enroll that person and create your tracking record with the Office of General Assembly for them, that system will automatically send them an email with a username and a password so that they will have access to the exam registration system. And again, from there, they can get to those preparation resources that I was mentioning just a moment ago. So it's very important that you be the ones to set those up. That way, their account is associated with your presbytery. They will show up on your roster. You will be able to get the request for authorization for exams. You'll get the results of the exams, all of those kind of things. We don't want the candidates creating their own accounts on the system, because then they can end up with two. One may be tied to your presbytery, one may not. They could end up logging in with one account to register, and then when it came time to take the test, they could log in with the other account, and suddenly they can't find the exam. So it's very, very important then that they use that single account that you create for them for all of their exam-related activities, so that all of their exam record is maintained in one place. So if you get a question from an inquirer or candidate, and they're saying, I went to the site to register, and it says, you all have to give me a username. Well, they're kind of reading into what it says there. It tells them the same thing. They need to use the account created for them by the presbytery. You won't give them the username, but when you enroll them as an inquirer or candidate, they get that email with that information. If they happen to delete that email, they can go back and there's a forgot your username and password where they can recover their username, create a new password, anything that they need to do. But the creating of the base account is your responsibility, so that there'll be one account that will gather all the information about their inquiry and candidacy process, but also be sure that all of their exam results are in the one place. The inquirers and candidates, the only thing that they can change on that site, other than adding exam registrations, is their contact information in their profile. But this also makes this a very good way for them to keep you apprised if they change email address or cell phone numbers or physical address. They can go into the site and update it there. And because this is the same account that's used on the P4M site, where you go to find all of your information about your inquirers and candidates, it will automatically be updated there as well. So do encourage them to do that. We will occasionally have folks who'll say, oh, I went to my profile and it says I'm an inquirer, but I was moved to candidacy. Well, the candidate can't change that information, but it's a kind of prod to them to remind you to be sure that you've gone into the reporting system and updated their account. Now, you will authorize individuals to take the ordination exams. And the way that that will happen is when they register for an exam that requires authorization, your CPM moderator or the contact person that you have set up with our office will get an email that will say, this individual has signed up to take exams and we need your authorization, and it will have a link. It's a coded link that will take you directly to a page like the one here on the slide, where you will be able to see the name of the individual, what exams that they are requesting to take. If it's a Bible content exam and they're wanting to take it with a special proctor, you'll see the name of that person so that you can say, yes, that's in fact the person we agreed to supervise this administration. If they've requested any accommodations like extended time, you'll see all of that information. And you can review all of that information and be sure it is what you have discussed with the person. And yes, that's what we're expecting to do. And then you would click the little button at the bottom that says authorize and then submit that. And that's how you will notify us that the person has your approval to take the exam that are listed with the accommodations or special proctor that is listed, that all of those are what you were expecting. If someone has not talked with you ahead of time, or you're seeing something there that's not what you were expecting or what you had talked with them in advance about doing, then you can decline that. And you should know that we actually don't collect the funds for the registration until you authorize it. So they're not, they haven't paid any money or anything. If it's just somebody that says, they've signed up to take an exam and you're not ready for them to take it, then just decline it. They'll get a notification to contact you and discuss why you made that decision. If you accidentally hit the decline, you can just go back to the link again, authorize it, and it will go through. Now, if you accidentally authorize it, you will need to contact me to correct that, because once you do hit that authorize button, that's when we do collect the fee. And so we would need to arrange to refund those funds that have been collected from their payment source. It's not a problem if you do a mistake. It happens sometimes. We're glad to help you correct it. But do know that while you can override a decline, to override and authorize, you would need to contact us so that we can be sure that all of the necessary steps get followed to be sure everything is set back. The General Assembly requires, as we've kind of mentioned quickly in passing, that there are 5 areas of examination. There's a Bible content exam, a Bible exegesis exam, an exam on the polity of the church, on theological competence, and on worship and sacraments. We're not going to delve a lot into the details of each of those exams, but one of the things that I do want to kind of point out while we've got this here is that the theological competence exam its focus is a little different than what a lot of people think. A lot of people think it's a test to see whether their theology is reformed or not. And that is not what that test is about. The decision about whether an individual's theological positions of their own faith and what they teach to others is within the Reformed tradition resides with the presbytery that would consider them for ordination. That's the body that makes that. So this is not, if you will, an orthodoxy exam. This is about an exam about their theological competence, which is understood in this context to mean, are they familiar with the Reformed tradition? Do they know how it compares and contrasts to other theological traditions? And are they able to formulate a theological argument and to teach the theological understandings? So that's what the exam is about. It's not a test to see whether their theology is acceptable. That's a decision that comes at the stage of ordination by the ordaining presbytery. But I do want us to walk through and look at some of the purposes of these exams and how we help to support the candidates to be ready to take them. We're going to start by looking at the Bible content exam. The Bible content exam is given online twice a year, and it's given on the same platform as those preparation materials that I mentioned earlier. So it's given on the Moodle platform. That allows them to become familiar with the testing system before it comes time to take the day of the actual Bible content exam itself. In fact, there is, as part of those preparation materials, a full-length Bible content exam that they can take and see how they're doing on the exam, see what sections they need to work on, become familiar with how the computer software works, that it has a way, for example, to flag a question if you want to come back and review it, so they can get very, very familiar with that. Then the Bible content exam consists of 90 questions that are in multiple choice format. So a question where you will select A, B, C, or D as your response, and 2 questions that are matching format. So in those cases, so there might be a series of 5 quotations and 5 prophets, and you have to say which prophet is associated with each of those quotations, or maybe characters and stories who say certain things. The way that those matching questions are scored is that each match counts as 1 point, because it is a, if you will, a nugget of information, just like you would get from a multiple choice question. And they are proportionally scored, so that if you get 3 of the 5 matches right and 2 of them you mismatch, you will get 3 points. So it's not 5 points or nothing. So they are proportionally scored so that the weighting is the same as it is for the multiple choice questions. So this is, again, multiple choice matching. It's machine scoreable, which means that they get their results as soon as they finish. They do need to get a score of 70 or higher to satisfy the requirement, which means that they don't need to take the Bible content exam again. If they score less than 70, then they will need to take the exam again, score higher than 70 in order to receive a satisfactory evaluation in this area of competency that's required by the General Assembly. All questions that have been that were used on the Bible content exam in its first 4 decades, from about 1970s up until 2010, all of those questions have been retired. Since 2010, when we started giving the exam, actually in the fall of 2009, when we started giving the exam online, we've been developing new questions that are being utilized on the online exams. And so if you've got old archives, they're great. They can, the nature of the questions really hasn't changed. They can still practice with those, but those questions have been retired and they are not used on the current exams. All of the questions that have been developed since 2010 are on past exams are available in English, Korean, and in Spanish as part of that equipped site resource that I mentioned to you earlier. So, you know, what's going on? Why did we retire some questions? Why were others not used? Well, as we're going to talk about in a moment, each Bible content exam is a mixture of new questions and repeated questions, which is part of how the PCC, the President's Cooperative Committee, helps to assure that there's a fairly consistent level of difficulty, excuse me, from one administration to the next. Over time, there were some folks who had gone either at their seminaries, they had collected past exams, or some individuals had gone online and made kind of online databases of questions. And the PCC was concerned was that not everybody had access to those questions. And even when they did, they didn't, if you were taking the exam in Korean or Spanish, you didn't have access to the questions in those languages. So the PCC now takes care to be sure that there's an even access to questions that have been used in the past by providing them in this training resource that is available to everyone, and by providing the questions in all 3 languages in which the BCE is administered. So every question since 2010 is available in English, Spanish, and Korean on that website. Let's see, I've got a question here in the chat. Let me go ahead and take this one because I'm not sure it ties in too much. It says, can someone take a particular exam without taking the corresponding course of that subject? Can they do an audit, let's say, of the course and make an attempt at the exam? You decide when you think a person is ready to take the exam. So in the case of the Bible content exam, they don't need your authorization to take the Bible content exam. They would need it if they want extra time, or they would need it if they want to have a special proctor, those kind of things. For the senior ordination exams, when you are authorizing them to take the exam, what you are actually authorizing is you're saying to the Presbytery's Cooperative Committee, we as a CPM are confident that this person is ready to take and to write satisfactory responses to the questions in this exam area. I'll talk a little bit more about that particular detail of it when we talk about the senior exams a bit later. So you're basically certifying that this individual has had the necessary coursework and supervised practice of ministry to be ready to take those exams in the areas of exegesis, church polity, theology, and worship. It's up to you to decide what those requirements are. They may be attending a seminary that is not a Presbyterian seminary, and they don't even have the option of taking a Presbyterian Church USA polity course for credit as a part of their degree. So you would then need to decide, well, do we want them to audit a course online from a seminary that does offer it? Whatever. You sort that out. And it's up to you then to make the determination. So if you're fine with them just having audited a course, that's fine. If you think that they need to take it for credit so that you have a sense of how well they actually understood the course, which you don't get any feedback if they audit about how well they understood it or were able to apply it. So those kind of decisions are up to you in determining when you think that they're ready. But it is you. That's what you're doing when you're authorizing. You're not just saying, sure, go out and try it. You're actually saying to the Presbytery's Cooperative Committee, if this person doesn't get a satisfactory evaluation, we will be surprised because we are confident that they are prepared and ready to take this test. All right. Turning then back to the Bible content exam. The purpose of the Bible content exam, according to the General Assembly, is to assess the candidate's knowledge of the form and content of the Bible. So that's the instruction that was in the action from the General Assembly that created the Bible content exam. And that was the direction that they then gave to the Presbytery's Cooperative Committee on Exams to go and then develop a test that would do that. So the PCC expanded a little bit on that as to their understanding of their directive from the General Assembly. And they say that assessment of a candidate's knowledge of form and content means that what they're trying to do is to determine whether a person under care of a presbytery in the preparation for ministry process has the necessary familiarity with the scriptures that the church expects in its ministers of the word and sacrament. Now that's important because notice it talks about the necessary familiarity with the scriptures. What both the General Assembly and the PCC, following on its instruction, are concerned about is that a person have a kind of basic level of what might be referred to as biblical literacy. Do they have a kind of baseline understanding of what is in the Bible? Particularly in this day and age of smartphones, where everybody has, the whole Bible on their phone, we sometimes hear from, candidates who say, why do I need to take a test where somebody asked me who built the ark? If I can't remember who built the ark, you draw your own conclusion about that one. This is a pretty simple example. If I can't remember who built the ark, I can just grab my smartphone and I can type in who built the ark. Or if somebody says, I don't remember which prophet said, let justice roll down like waters. Well, I can Google, let justice roll down like waters and find out who said that. Find out it was Amos who said that. Well, what the PCC and the General Assembly are saying is, we realize that, but you need to have a general familiarity of the scriptural tradition to be a minister of the word and sacrament. You can't just always be looking things up, in part because sometimes you got to know what to look up. So, do you have a familiarity with the Psalms so that if you're trying to give comfort to someone, you know where to look in the Psalms at that moment? If you are working on a sermon series dealing with social justice issues, that you know which prophets touch on the themes that you're going to be taking up. So that there are some things that you need to be able to have a kind of recall knowledge of the scriptural tradition. And that's what this exam is about. It does it by using specific questions from across the scriptural tradition to assess general Bible knowledge. So it's not like somebody has sat down, the PCC has sat down, and there's more than 1,000 questions in this database since 2010, and tried to figure out what are the 1,000 most important things that somebody should know about the Bible. And we're going to ask them those 1,000 things or some subset of them. That's not what the test is trying to do. What it's doing is using questions with a range of difficulty. So from who built the ark to much more focused content about perhaps even which of the synoptic gospels includes a specific story. They use some specific questions from across the scripture to generalize about how well you know the scriptures. This is a method that's used in educational assessments in a variety of disciplines and professional fields. If you know this material to this level of detail in this area, then you're likely to know it similarly in other areas. But the other thing, though, is then to identify, are there areas where there is relative strengths and weaknesses? So somebody may know the Gospels very well, but not know the prophets very well. And so one of the purposes of the exam is to help you then to be able to direct people. So this exam is actually designed to be taken fairly early after the first year of seminary, because you may need to tell folks and direct them that as they're selecting their elective courses in biblical studies, that you need them to take courses in certain areas because they need to build up their knowledge of that. So for example, the first time we gave the test online, it's been more than a decade ago now, we had someone who scored like 82%, something like that. Pretty, fairly decent score, certainly satisfied the requirement, well above 70. But the questions on Paul and Paul's letters, they got less than half of those questions right. So even though that individual didn't need to take the Bible content exam again, that CPM really needed to say, okay, Paul is pretty important to understanding the scriptural basis for Reformed theology. If you don't have a basic understanding of Paul, we need you to be sure you take a course on Paul's theology and letters while you're in seminary. And so that's one of the other things that the test allows you to do, is to get a sense of where their relative strengths and weaknesses are in their knowledge of the tradition. So how does the test allow you to do that? Well, every Bible content exam distributes those 100 points that I talked about in exactly the same way across the canon. There are only 17 points that have to do with the Pentateuch, 13 points to do with the historical books, 10% of the points have to do with the Psalms and the wisdom literature, 17 points have to do with the prophets, 18 points to do with the Gospels, 15 points on Acts and Paul's letters, and then 10% of the points on Hebrews through the book of Revelation. So you can go back and look and see if they missed a whole group of questions, if they missed a lot of questions about the prophets, that will show up when you look at the exam results, when you go through the specific exam results with your inquirer or candidate. And so that will help you to see, maybe of the 18 questions on the gospel, they got 17 of them right. Great job. They know the gospels well. If they got 3 right out of the 10 questions on Hebrews through Revelation, then they need to do some work to bolster their understanding of that part of the tradition. So this distribution of the questions is very key then to helping you to use the test in your assessment of how well they know different parts of the scriptural tradition. So what kind of questions are these? Well, the first thing to understand about the Bible content questions is these are not questions about interpretation. They're not questions about historical background. You can quite literally, for every question, because they are set up this way in the database, and they're set up this way in the way that the results are reported, there is a specific verse or verses that provide the content or the answer to each question. But the types of questions that are asked about the content of the Bible fall into three categories, going back to that General Assembly instruction given to the Presbytery's Cooperative Committee on Exams. There are to be questions about the stories. That's pretty straightforward. Most people don't have a problem, figuring out what that's about. Yeah, I need to know basically the story. I need to know it was Daniel in the lion's den and not Jeremiah. I need to know that, in fact, the Bible does not say that Mary Magdalene, if you were, listening to the scripture lessons and the gospel that was appointed for last Sunday, the Bible does not say it was Mary Magdalene who washed Jesus' feet with her tears. The Bible doesn't say what the woman's name was. So, do you know the stories? So that's the first kind of question. The second kind of question has to do with themes. So do you know the key themes of Scripture and the content of the Bible that demonstrates those themes? Now, this is one of the places where it can be very helpful then to be able to go back and to think about if every question has to go back to a specific Scripture verse, how then do you ask that question about a theme? I can't ask you, for example, which of the general letters has as a specific theme a concern for orphans and widows and people who are economically distressed, because that's an interpreted question. So how does the PCC create a question about themes? Well, what they will do is they will typically give a verse that is one of the ones that builds up that theme. So they might, for example, if taking the example I just gave you, they might say which letter includes the following verse. And the verse would be, true religion and undefiled before God is this, to care for widows and orphans in their distress and to keep themselves unstained by the world. Well, that verse is found in the letter of James. That verse was not picked at random out of the letter of James. It was picked specifically because it illustrates and contributes to the building up of a theme in the letter that begins there. It's picked up in chapter 2, where it talks about the holding the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ with discriminatory intent, giving honor to the person with the fine clothing and the golden ring, turning away people, saying, God fill you and provide you with the things you need in life, but you give nothing to help. Picked up in chapter 5 with the wages that you have withheld from your workers. So that verse is one of the ones that establishes a theme in the letter. So sometimes people will look at this and say, why did they pick that verse? Well, it's never just because somebody opened the Bible and put their finger down and said, okay, let's make a question about that. Those verses are picked because they illustrate a knowledge of the themes. And so you need, if you're taking the test, you need to kind of stop and ask yourself, okay, who does this sound like? What is the theme of this? Where would I have found that and heard that before? So that's how they ask questions about themes. They might also, for example, say, a key theme of the letter of James is to care for widows and orphans, or to care for those who are economically dislocated. And say which of the following verses illustrates that. And so they might use James 1:21, caring for widows and orphans in their distress. And they might also use other verses that talk about the poor. Blessed are the poor, for they shall inherit the earth. But you need to know that that's not part of James. That's from the Beatitudes, which then leads me to the next kind of passage. The next thing the content is, and that's key passages. So these can be key passages, both because they illustrate themes or they're key to understanding a particular book or its theology, but they can also be key passages because they factor in other places in the life of the church and the use of the scriptures in the church. So the Beatitudes are key passages for our understanding. The words of the institution for the Lord's Supper, knowing that those are in 1 Corinthians, that's a key passage to know where that's found. So sometimes a passage may be key, not necessarily even because it's central to maybe even the point of the book from which the passage appears initially, but because of the way it's used elsewhere in the scriptural tradition. So, Hebrew Bible scholars can argue about whether "out of Egypt have I called my son" is a key passage to understanding the book of Hosea, but it certainly becomes a key passage when Matthew uses it to talk about how that Jesus is the Messiah in the birth narrative section of Matthew. So when you think about key passages, it's both key to understanding of the books where they're located, but could also be their key for other reasons. Right, noticing we've got another question here in the chat. It says, understanding that one does not need to have a good knowledge of biblical languages to take the biblical Hebrew or Greek languages to pass the exegesis exam. The requirement of biblical Hebrew or Greek are still requisite to complete the certified ready for call ordination, according to the Book of Order, unless the particular presbytery waives that. Okay, let me hold that one for a moment, William, and I'll talk about that when we talk about the exegesis exam here in just a moment. Because there are, in fact, some questions, that are designed that in such a way that you really can't answer that question without some background knowledge on that, but we'll come to that in just a moment. Okay. Wrapping up quickly then on Bible content exam. The resources, again, first thing they need to do is they need to read widely in the Bible. And when they read, they should read from the New Revised Standard Version if they're going to be taking the test in English, because all of the quotations that are used will come from the Revised Standard Version. So they should be getting familiar with its language and the way it phrases things. So for example, most of us probably know the passage about Jesus, saying, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock," from the King James Version. But if a question were to be asked about that passage from Revelation on the Bible content exam, it would be as it's phrased in the New Revised Standard Version. It says, "Look, I am standing at the door knocking," right? So probably nobody's going to be too tripped up by that. But again, regardless of what their favorite translation is of the scripture or their preferred translation, when they're studying for this test, they should be reading in the New Revised Standard Version. I talked about those themes. A good way to prepare to get questions about the themes is if you look at those introductions in a good study Bible, you will find that the writers will talk about the themes, and they'll always then provide in parentheses a list of scripture references that will lay out and demonstrate that, yes, indeed, that's a theme of this book. One of the reasons why I can rattle off that stuff about James with you all is because I actually wrote the notes on James for the New Oxford Annotated Study Bible. And that's one of the things I talked about. The theme of James is this, and I give then in parentheses those references that I mentioned. I don't write out the full text, not enough space at the introduction and study Bible, but I do provide just the scripture references. So you want to encourage your inquirers and candidates to read those materials, but then to look up those passages, because those passages that show up and get emphasized in those introductions are going to be key to understanding the book. They're going to be key to establishing themes. And so really being familiar with some of those can be very helpful, because those are the types of specific passages that could show up in a question. And then finally, they should review the outlines of biblical books to kind of learn what's in what. So what is the storyline in Matthew, and how is it different than in John? So that you would notice that, for example, that the cleansing of the temple in John comes very early in the gospel, before the last week of Jesus' life, whereas in the synoptic gospels, it always occurs in the last week of Jesus' life. So again, looking at the outlines can help them to get a sense of the narrative and the storylines. It can also help them to understand what topics come up in which books. So again, those are some tools and some ways that they can use to help them in their preparation. Okay, I do want to shift gears now and talk about the senior exams. The senior ordination exams, unlike the Bible content exam, which is given twice a year, the senior ordination exams are given 3 times each year. They are given at the end of September the end of January and the end of April. The results are available roughly 2 weeks after the exams are administered. Part of that is because the submission of the theology, polity, and worship exams happens, and then the Bible exegesis exam is not submitted until about 5 days later. So there's a very different submission timeline for them. But the exam results are actually released about 10 days after the submission deadline for the exegesis exam. So once the exegesis exams are submitted, we do some plagiarism screening, some things like that. And then the exam readers begin their work on the Monday after the exegesis exams are submitted on a Thursday. And then the Monday after the exegesis, after the reading week begins is when you will have the results. So it takes about, depending on where you count it from, if you're counting it from the submission of the polity exam or the exegesis exam, about 2 weeks after they're submitted. The senior exams are not given with a proctor supervision. All of these exams now are open book. So if you have been ordained as long as I have, that was not the case when you took these exams, but it is the way they are now. They are fully booked, fully open book, but the only exam that requires people to use other resources is the exegesis exam. If you choose to use a theology book in responding to a theology question, you're free to do that, but you do have to cite it as you would in an academic paper. They are not allowed during the period that they are taking the exam, though, to discuss or consult with others. So, even occasionally somebody will send me an email or will call me on the phone and say, listen, I'm working on the polity question. I don't quite understand what they're asking. Can you clarify the question for me? The answer is no, because not everybody who's taking this test will hear what I'm saying to you. So they are not allowed to consult with others, either to clarify the questions or to kind of run by their responses. Does this sound right? Is this the direction I should be going? No, it has to be their own work as they're doing it. Now, the test takers have up to 9 hours to take the polity, the theology, and the worship exams. The exams are not designed to take 9 hours to complete. They are designed to be finished in about 3 hours of focused work. So if you sit down and you really focus and you work on it, you can finish those exams in 3 hours. So why do you have 9 hours? Well, the reason that you now have 9 hours to take it and not the 3 hours that I had when I took these things back in the 1990s is because the General Assembly was concerned that, particularly when the exams went online, that the time constraints and pressures were really beginning to impact the candidates. And so they asked the PCC, can you provide a way to take some of that time pressure off? Well, most of you probably don't know this because it was the case even longer before than when I took the exams. But initially, the exegesis exam was also a proctored timed test. You had 4 hours to do the whole exegesis exam, and you took it under a proctor supervision. There were resources that you could look at, but you only had 4 hours. And the PCC very quickly, they only did that for 4 or 5 years. They sorted out and said, you know what, that's not how we write Bible studies. It's not how we do sermon preparation, study scripture for those ends. So they changed that to make it a multi-day test, not because they thought it would take you 4 or 5 days to do the work, working 8 hours a day. They really thought you would spend between 8, 12, maybe 15 hours on that test. But you spread it out over the course of several days amidst other demands and responsibilities, because that's the way most ministers actually do Bible study, prepare Bible studies, and integrate scriptural interpretation into sermon writing. So when the General Assembly asked them to look at the other areas of exams, they said, okay, let's use that as a model. So the 9 hours is not an algebra problem. They didn't say, let's go from 1 hour per section, let's go to 3 hours per section to give them more time. 9 hours is because that's a work day with breaks for lunch and coffee and taking the occasional phone call and maybe even picking the kids up at the bus stop. It's a work day. And so you basically, the structure of the exams now, even in polity, theology, and worship, is here are 3 ministry tasks that you will encounter today, and you need to finish by the end of the day. And so that's where that 9 hours comes from. It gives time for them to read a question, to reflect on it, gives time for them to write their response and proofread it, to take breaks as they feel the need to. But they do need to finish these 3 tasks in that one day. So that's the structure of the exams now, very different than the old proctored senior exams of several decades ago. The purpose of these exams is not, they're not really intended to be diagnostic. Excuse me a minute. They're not intended to be diagnostic. They're not intended to tell you something that you don't already know. This is where, again, I mentioned, kind of referred to this a bit early in responding to one of the questions. When you authorize somebody to take these exams, you're telling the PCC, we expect them to get a satisfactory response, write a satisfactory response, and receive a satisfactory evaluation. So they really shouldn't, you should not be surprised by the outcome of these tests. So why are they given? Well, what they are really is they're designed to be a chance for you to consult with your colleagues in other presbyteries. They're really designed to kind of say, we think based on our review of this person, their academic work, the reports from the supervised practice with ministry, maybe our own direct observations of them in ministry, that they're ready to be certified so that they can go to look for a call and be possibly examined on the floor of a presbytery for ordination. We want your feedback on that. And so that's what the readers are doing. And they're also doing it through a process of blind review. I'll come to that in just a moment. But they're doing it without, in fact, having had 2 years of engagement with this person. They're going to respond to what happens in these exam responses the way that the people in the first call are going to respond. If you start your first call, that congregation doesn't, or even your second or third, that new congregation doesn't have several years of experience with you to say, oh, yeah, normally you would have done that better. I understand there's a lot going on at the moment. They're just going to get a kind of cold response to that issue. And that's what these exams are really designed to try to replicate. Without being colored either positively or negatively by previous experience, how do you experience the competency that is being demonstrated in this exam response? So the way that these exams are structured then is they're built on 4 key principles, and they've been set up this way for more than 50 years. First is that principle of blind review. This is somebody who comes to these responses cold. It's not so much that they come to them objectively. The PCC doesn't really use that language. What they really are trying to say is they come to this and are only able to respond to, well, what happened in this response? What did you do in the moment, if you will? And they can't then be kind of influenced by, well, we've known you've handled that kind of situation better 5 times previously when I've seen it. Well, at first assessment, that the response on that examination on the floor of presbytery, people can't draw on that past experience. So how is this person being perceived by colleagues in ministry who don't have a reservoir of knowledge about the person to draw on? The second principle is what a study of the preparation of clergy defined as pastoral imagination. There was a series of books that were produced by the Carnegie Endowment several years ago about preparing people for the professions. And they looked at how you train doctors and psychologists and architects and engineers and clergy. And what they found when they looked at people who were specialists in the formation of clergy was that one of the key things is what is called pastoral imagination. It's the ability to move into a section with imagination and a knowledge of a religious tradition, and to apply that tradition creatively to the circumstances that are there. And that's why all of the senior ordination exams are case studies. Every one of the questions is essentially a case study. It's why it's so important that they not only have just had a course in polity or Reformed theology, but they also have had supervised practice of ministry so that they know how to apply and use that in imaginative ways. And of course, that importance of that imagination is key. If you think about even our ordination vows, right? I think for most of the people I know that are ordained to ordered ministry in the Presbyterian Church, one of their favorite is the vow to serve the people with energy, intelligence, imagination, and love. And that's part of what these exams are trying to do, is to assess that ability to draw on their academic training and their gifts for ministry and to respond in a ministry context. The standard of evaluation is readiness to begin. So they're not looking to see, did you respond as a pastor would have who'd been in ministry for 25 years? So they may well say, as I might have said to a young associate pastor serving with me when I was in pastoral ministry, you could have handled that better. Next time that comes up, let's think about these things. That could still be a satisfactory response because they didn't make the situation worse, if you will. What they did was fine, but there may be better or stronger ways. And so you will see that in the comments that are written sometimes by the readers. They will say, this is good, but it would have been stronger if you had done something else. So the standard is not some objective score sheet on these exams, but does it demonstrate a readiness to begin? The final principle is that then you as the committee really need to read through these exams and the readers' evaluations and go through them with your inquirers and candidates so that it really does inform more than just did they get an S or a U and check a box, but you gain the insight. You may in fact see something in their responses that was not a concern to the readers, but is a concern to you. So it is very important that the whole exam process is not finished when you get the transcript emailed from my office. The whole process is only finished when you have looked at the exams themselves and read the candidates' responses and read the readers' comments and come to your own assessment about what that shows. So very, very important that you look at those. All right. Let me at this point then go back and take up this question then about, why do we still have the Greek or Hebrew? We have that because our understanding of readiness to begin ministry is that those who are going to be entrusted with teaching the scriptural tradition need to have a basic understanding of the languages in which they are given. You're correct. And I say this as a PhD in biblical studies who taught Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic for decades before I was in this job. If I were going to test your knowledge of Greek or Hebrew, I would have to give you a different kind of test. The exegesis exam is not set up to establish how well you know Greek or Hebrew as a technical matter of it. What they are designed to do is to assess your ability to use it as a tool in ministry. And they can do that, and they can do that effectively. But why do we have that requirement anymore at all? You really have to put that to the whole General Assembly and ask them to justify it again or to reevaluate it. But the best answer that I can give you is when my children, who are both now adults, were in high school, they both studied Spanish. And they both took courses in Spanish literature. Now, even at a high school level, I would expect the person who's going to teach them a course specifically in Spanish literature, even if it's not a Spanish class, is going to have at least a basic knowledge of Spanish so that they can understand maybe issues that come up in translation, that they can understand that what is lost by moving it over into English. And so that's really kind of what the root is for us and in our tradition. We don't expect people to be Greek or Hebrew scholars, trust me. That's not the intent, and it's not the measure. The measure is simply a kind of basic familiarity so that, for example, as you see in the questions on the exam, If you see two translations that are wildly different of a verse, you have some kind of tools to be able to go back and figure out from looking at commentaries, looking at the text, using lexicons to figure out how did these two very different translations emerge, and make a case for why you think one in a particular understanding of the passage as a whole is better than the other. So that's really what the test can measure. And it's what the intent is in that requirement. You'll agree with that or disagree with that, but that's the best rationale that I can give you for it. So somebody has commented in the chat that the exams have this kind of time management piece to them. Yes, they do. And I've always sometimes we'll get questions or comments back in the surveys that we do with the candidates afterwards, and they say, you know what, this is crazy. I never have that kind of rigid deadline in ministry. And I always want to just kind of check myself, but I always want to respond back to them. What do you think 11 a.m. on Sunday morning is? It's going to come around. It's going to come. You can't walk in on Sunday morning and say, listen, I just need 15 more minutes to finish up. I'll be with you shortly. Talk among yourselves. There are deadlines that you have to meet, and time management is a part of it. Somebody has pointed out that with commissions, a lot of presbyteries are no longer doing the ordination exam, the examination for ordination on the floor of presbytery. That's correct. Sometimes it is done by commissions. Really, what I'm seeing in talking with presbyteries, it depends. They tend to have commissions because they're large presbyteries with a lot of ministers coming and going, and so it takes a lot of time to do that, and so that's why they create the commissions to do it. Smaller presbyteries still very much do these on the floor of the presbytery. But you're right, there is a variety of practice, but it still takes place in some context. Bible exegesis exam should fairly be considered to be extended from 5 to 7 days for completion. Again, the idea really is that you shouldn't be needing 40 hours because you won't have 40 hours in ministry. That even given the fact that you've got to answer some exegetical questions that nobody asks you to write up and submit along with your sermon in the bulletin, still about 12 to 15 hours. And so the PCC does think that expectation of 12 to 15 hours of work over 5 days is sufficient. And it also helps to be sure that the timeline stays intact so that they can do the other things that need to be done in terms of plagiarism screening and all of that, and have the exams ready to be evaluated within just a couple of days of when those exams are submitted and stay on that timeline. When I started in this work, it took 12 to 13 weeks to get the ordination exam process back because it's all still paper-based. We've moved that down to about 12 days, but it does require that we have some kind of controls on how long this can all take so that we can keep things moving and get responses back to people in a timely manner. Okay, so let's move on here. So what is the biggest challenge with the exams? Well, it depends on who you ask. If you ask the candidates, they say, we don't know what the readers want or expect. The readers say, well, the candidate didn't answer what the question asked. And if you think about that, they're really just two takes from different vantage points of the same question. Somebody was looking for something in the response that wasn't available in what they were reading. And so we provide, as part of the training materials, I'm just going to hit this very, very quickly. I'm not going to try to do examples of it, but a way of exegeting a question that is based on how the PCC trains its readers. I'm going to cover it very quickly with you all, just so that you kind of have a sense of, hey, I could go look at that some more on the training or point your candidates toward it. Basically, we tell them that they need to start by examining what the premise or the basis of the question is. What is this question about? What is the focus of it? What is assumed in this case study? Second, they need to isolate the verbs in their objects. Specifically, they need to isolate imperative verbs. So if there are 3 imperative verbs, there need to be 3 parts to the response. So if it says cite and discuss, they need to both cite something from the Book of Confessions or the Book of Order, and they need to discuss it. It's not enough to simply give the reference or even quote the words. You need to discuss it. You need to explain it. So the verbs and their objects. If it's to write what? Write a sermon, write a Bible study, write a newsletter article. What is it you're supposed to do? So again, now even the exegesis exam is case study based. So you don't decide whether you're going to write a Bible study or a sermon about the passage. You're told you're going to write a Bible study or sermon for this specific ministry context. And so you have to be able to focus on that. So if you turn in a Bible study when they wanted a sermon, it's unsatisfactory. And you have to pay attention to those conjunctions and numbers. Is it cite and discuss? Then you've got to do both. If it says, provide 3 examples, you've got to provide 3. 2's not enough. You also don't want to provide 10, because if you're doing that, you're wasting time and space that could be used for other things. So if you're kind of curious, again, this is based on exactly how the resource papers for the readers are built up and developed by the PCC. They make very clear this is the premise. They've walked them through step by step that there are 3 imperative verbs. They just bullet point them out to be sure that they know that they're looking for 3 parts of the response. They point out the issues about numbers and so forth. So again, there's some very specific resources about this on the website, and in fact, some tools that they can use to practice using this method of analysis. So this is kind of more just to kind of give you an idea of something that's available for them. You will get, as I mentioned earlier in passing, a transcript with just the outcomes of the test. You can look at it at any time. There'll be complete history of their experiences with the test. And you will also get the readers, the candidates' responses and the readers' comments. All of this is maintained on a website where you can download it and have access to it at any time. And you can just read right straight through. Here was the question. Here's how the candidate responded. And here were the readers' comments and evaluations of those. And that's available to you at any time. So you can even, in the course of a meeting, you can go in and call that up and review that material if there's a question about it. Now, there will be some times when these assessments don't reflect the actual competencies that the candidate has. And you may appeal the evaluations that are given to exams. You may do that for 2 reasons. One, if there are technical errors in the reporting, so that the reader has input unsatisfactory for a section, but all they said was, oh, this was great, this is wonderful. They didn't identify any problems. Well, then why was it unsatisfactory? And then that triggered an unsatisfactory of that section, and then that triggered an unsatisfactory outcome for the whole exam. So if there seem to be technical errors in the way that the readers entered their responses and their evaluations, you can appeal on that. We usually catch almost all of those because every reader's comments are reviewed by 2 members of the PCC, but occasionally some things can slip through. You can also appeal if you think that the evaluation seems to miss key parts of the response. So if they said, well, this part is missing, and you say, well, I'm seeing that in this paragraph, then you can appeal. Candidates sometimes ask, well, can I appeal? And the answer is no, the candidate can't. They can't appeal, or at least they can't appeal to the PCC. In essence, if a candidate thinks that there's been a technical issue or that there were parts of their answers that were missed, they appeal to you as the CPM. And if you agree with them, then you can appeal on their behalf. And you would do that by sending a report to me that I forward on to the PCC that would lay out, we don't understand why this is unsatisfactory. All the comments are positive. The readers said they only gave 2. We found 3 citations, and it was unsatisfactory because it was missing a required citation. You write that up, and there's a review that happens where all of that material is reviewed by the PCC. So it is possible to appeal if you think that the evaluation is not appropriate for what was actually submitted. There may also be times when you will need to approve an alternate means of assessing competency. It is the case, taking with the senior exams for a moment, it is the case that there are some people whose competencies are always going to show much more freely and more strongly if they're engaged in conversation and give and take, because they can trial something. Well, if I were to say this to you, would you understand that, or do I need to try a different angle? Or they don't even have to ask the question. They're just listening to the response they get back and saying, okay, you didn't understand. I need to clarify that. You can't do that in an online testing platform. You can't ask Jose in the question, can you clarify what you meant by that? Because the computer screen is never going to give you more information than what it does. And so if you have certain individuals that you know that they're constantly, even when you're working with them and asking them questions, they're constantly engaging in reformulating responses and reworking. And it's very clear that they're not even clear what they want to say until they've asked you some follow-up questions. You may be able to say, this exam process is not going to work for this person. Or if it's somebody on the Bible content exam, this is not universally true, but there are some people with certain forms of ADHD who are so distracted by the incorrect options on a question, they get so worried about why is this person even in the list, that they can't recognize the correct answer anymore. And so the Bible content exam, although it's easier for most people because they just have to recognize from a limited range of options what the correct answer is, they can eliminate some and maybe all of them and just say, wasn't sure it was that, but I know it's not the other three. Some people, it has exactly the opposite. They can't see the correct answer anymore because of the distractions of the alternatives. So when you have those kind of situations, then you can provide an alternate means of assessing the competency. So you do that when the problem is with the standard examination method. That's why these are called alternative means. So you change the means of assessment from a multiple choice test to another kind of assessment. You change the means of a purely written response to a case study on a computer to something other than that, so that you can give the person the opportunity to demonstrate the competencies that we're seeking for them to demonstrate. You should do this really only when you're ready to certify the individual, but you can't because they don't have the satisfactory evaluations on the exams. There's not any point to go to all the time and the trouble and the effort to develop these alternative means and administer them if you're not going to certify them ready for other reasons. So this is kind of not a last resort, but it is the kind of thing of where you want to, this is one of the last things that you want to consider, because there's no reason to go to the presbytery and ask for it, to go to the trouble to develop it and administer it, if there are other reasons why you would not certify that person to be ready for examination for a call. It does require a 3/4 vote of the presbytery for approval. So a committee or even a commission cannot authorize an alternative means. It has to go to the whole presbytery. That supermajority requirement of a 3/4 vote means it's beyond the scope of any commission to reach that level. And so these always have to be considered by the full presbytery and not by either committee or commission. So what are some models of some different ways that you can do some of these? Bible content exam, I mentioned about people who get so distracted by the alternative options that they don't recognize, can't locate the correct answer. So we've had good success with folks who have that particular issue by simply taking a Bible content exam and turning them into fill in the blank or open-ended questions. We take the distraction away so that they can show the competency. Yes, they really were able to recall that without the distraction of the alternative responses. Bible exegesis, have the person actually prepare a Bible study, do an exegesis, prepare a Bible study, see if they can answer the questions that come up from the evaluators. So, how do they respond? Are they able to draw on things that they've read that they hadn't planned to talk about in response to a question? Are they willing to have the humility to say, you know what, I don't know, I'll have to get back to you on that. So, again, rather than simply having them write an exegesis and then give you an outline of a Bible study or a sermon, have them actually deliver it and engage with folks to see how they do. Church polity, have them do a mock session meeting. So, the first part of the polity exam is always kind of foundations. How does this live out in the life of the church? And then there are specific cases that come up in the last two sections of the exam. So tell them, we need you to prepare a session training piece that's going to start a session meeting with, so about 15-minute presentation to teach them about this principle of our polity and how we live it out. And then tell them that, you're going to come in and you're going to run the session meeting. So we need you to put together a docket. We're going to have you moderate the meeting. We're going to have you do the training. And then when you come to do it for these, the evaluators who are going to be your mock session, one of them will be your clerk of session, and they're going to say, hey, you know what, Pastor, I'm so glad you're back. While you're away, a couple of things came up and I added them to the agenda. And so now they've got 30 minutes to kind of consult the book of order, to kind of get ready, and then moderate the session through the dealing with those issues. Again, this is not something that anybody who's been in pastoral ministry has never experienced. It happens all the time. So you can create a situation where you're now moving them outside, it's written into a very different way of assessing the competencies that we're really trying to get at. Right keyboard here. Theological competence. Have them role play interactions with parishioners so that you can see how they either clarify or respond when somebody clearly didn't understand. How do they restate something? So have your role players at times deliberately misinterpret what they're being told and see how the candidate responds. And do they factor that into their thinking? Same thing with worship and sacraments. Have them prepare detailed orders of worship, including special services like weddings or funerals. Include mock consultations with the bride or the groom and those kind of things. So when the main thing here is that when you go alternative, really go alternative. If there's something about the structure of the standard exam that's blocking them, then do all that you can to remove those impediments from the standard exam and give them an alternate way of demonstrating the competencies. Because the General Assembly has been very clear when it's been asked to revisit this question about these exams and several times over the years, that the competencies need to be demonstrated. We are convinced that they are essential. We recognize that some people will be able to demonstrate them in some other ways, and we want to accommodate that. But a waiver or an alternative means is not warranted simply because the person can't meet the standard. If they have to demonstrate that they meet the standard through an alternative means. They're not just simply, okay, that was too hard, let's give you something easier. The Assembly really does believe that these competencies are essential to effective ministry and require them of all those who are going to be ordained. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and I'm going to look over here and go through some more of these chat questions. Again, if you have questions, feel free to put them in. Again, some more question about the timing on the exegesis exam. That's exactly the need. Somebody's got in the chat about a need to rest and sleep and do research to complete the exegesis. That's exactly why it's 5 hours and not the 4 hours that it was at the beginning, or 5 days, excuse me, and not the 4 hours that it was at the beginning. So again, the PCC really thinks that over 5 days, you've got the 12 or 15 hours that would be typically what's available to folks. And so they have felt actually with that structure of that exam, that goes back over 30 years, and they're fairly comfortable that that's an appropriate period of time for that, precisely to include the things that are being raised in the comment about rest and research and so forth. I think that the current time frame for the exegesis is about right. The local presbytery, I believe, can grant extended time. No, you can't give extended time on any of the senior exams. Presbytery can only extend the time for the Bible content exam, which is that proctored test. When since the exegesis exam went to a multi-day format back in the late 70s, early 80s, they have never allowed you to give more time, to extend time within the standard exam process for the exegesis exam. When they added the workday model to the other areas of examination, likewise, they said no time extensions on those. So if you feel that somebody just has to have more time than that to do it, then you're going to be looking at an alternate means of assessment. And you probably need to be kind of asking yourself, and what if you really cannot prepare the exegesis exam in 5 days, are you going to be able to prepare 2 or 3 Bible studies and a sermon, which was a pretty normal work week for me when I was in pastoral ministry, and doing that, all of that on 7-day rotations, and throwing in the occasional funeral and wedding on top of all of that. What is it telling you about their ability to do this work? Another question here. Having trouble getting the final signed hard copies of the CPM candidate review documents in a presbytery file. Can any of the requirements be met through electronic document and online file? And I'm not sure I exactly know what signed documents you're talking about. So you may want to come off mute long enough and clarify that question for me. I'm going to model my candidate who can't quite figure out what's going on from what's on the computer screen. So Anne, can you clarify for me what documents we're talking about?
Sure. Anne McMicken, elder from Rochester, New York. We have several required forms. They have listed names and numbers that include the original application to become a candidate, and then required annual review and update. And so we each are assigned to our candidates. We work with them constantly, and then they come back to committee review every year. And at that time, they update 2 forms. Right. And they send those to the committee for review. Then we're supposed to meet with the person, discuss it after the review, update it, sign it, and get it into a file at the presbytery. During COVID, that becomes difficult. We're meeting by Zoom in many, many cases. And I was tasked with looking at our files to see how we're doing, and we're doing abysmally for getting things into the file for the last year and a half or 2. And our committee chair said, oh, we'll just turn to electronic document review, which might get us from person to person electronically, but still doesn't get a final signed copy of that document in a folder in the presbytery office. Is it time for us to update the way that's done?
Yeah, so this is broader than just exams then. That's what I was trying to clarify here. The sample forms that we produced in my office, they're not required that they be used because the documentation needs to be specific to your processes. They're in PDF form. And so they can be, as long as people only work with them in Adobe, they can fill those in and it will capture them, and they can save it, and with their name as part of the file name, and email it around. You could put it in a Dropbox, everybody can do it. So the one thing that you may need to do is to think about, are you ready then to accept as a signature that they have typed their name on the form, and you kind of match, okay, they sent this form as an attachment from their personal email address. And the combination of it was sent from their personal email address with their type name, we're considering that's a signature. Somebody else would have had to hack their email, so that's good enough for us for a signature. Then if you do need a paper version of it, you can then print out those PDFs. That online review of the whole exam, once you've got that in your browser screen, for example, you can hit print to PDF, and you can create a PDF of that record. So, you do have to be very careful if you start looking at online documentation and file sharing. I know several years ago we were using Dropbox for some of this kind of stuff, and people would think they were copying files from the Dropbox folder, and they were actually removing them from the Dropbox folder and putting them on their local computer. So you need to be, pretty careful about what kind of systems you use for that. There's questions about security and access and things of that nature. But there are some ways to do those kind of things. I've known a few places where they were concerned about that, and so they actually use screen sharing to display documentation that needed to be reviewed in a meeting, rather than emailing around a dozen attachments or something. So yeah, and we're all dealing with these challenges. The technology is catching up. There are some alternatives, but the main one is kind of think about what will satisfy you, that you're actually, in terms of the signature, that I'm actually getting something from that person. And that's the main thing you'll want to figure out. One way that some people do that, I mean, I just did a contract to write for a study Bible, and I just typed my name into the form. But to get to the form, I had to be logged in to a link that I could only get because of my email. And so they were quite satisfied that they had met the legal requirements of verifying I was the one who had typed that in. And so it was as good as my actual physical signature. Yeah, on an Adobe Acrobat has digital signatures, and sometimes it even allows you, although my signature is bad enough anyway, but when I have to try to write it with my finger on a touchpad, or worse yet, try to use a mouse on a screen. But there are some other digital kinds of ways of capturing it. Most of the digital ways now are moving away from trying to mimic the physical signature to some other kind of verification of who provided the information and using that as a signature. Is there any alternative for a person of the third age, other than learning the basic technology to be engaged in studies to become an ordained minister in the PCUSA? So when we first began moving the exams to an online environment, there were folks who were saying, I don't have the tech savvy to do this. What we did when we designed the systems is we really designed them to a very low technical standard, so that the exam system that they use to take these tests is no more complicated than responding to a comment on Facebook. In fact, we actually built the system to mimic a blog where people write something and people write comments and responses. So we have really reduced it to the lowest level that we can. You can actually take the Bible content exam on a smartphone. You could take the senior exams on a smartphone, but I wouldn't want to thumb type a 600-word response. So, we really have taken it down to a kind of a baseline level where we really think that we've hit a kind of common corporate least common denominator. We tell them, for example, in terms of using Greek and Hebrew, it's perfectly fine. If you don't know how to enact a Hebrew keyboard, you can choose transliteration, and that's perfectly acceptable. So we've done, a number of things that we can do to really kind of get it down to a point where we think, yeah, we really are working at a level that we can assume is a kind of baseline level of competency. But I've got to tell you, this is an issue for exam readers as well. And so, when you're thinking about your exam readers, all of their work is online. None of it is paper-based. All of their training is online. Again, we've done it all to make it no more complicated than navigating Facebook and responding to it's a little more than a thumbs up, though, even the satisfactory, unsatisfactory, you just pick an S or a U, and then you write your comment like you would, comment on a Facebook post. But if people are not comfortable with that, and they're not comfortable with getting email notifications about reminders to do things, then yeah, they're probably not really, they're going to be frustrated by things about reading exams that have nothing to do with the exams. And we don't need to put people in that kind of bind. But we really have endeavored, we do accessibility training to be sure that the exams work with screen readers for people who are visually impaired. All of these things, we use a kind of lowest common denominator on the technical side to be sure that they're as accessible as possible. I'm not seeing anything else in the chat. And Sandana, I think we're coming up on the top of the hour. So
we are, and I want to thank you so much. I learn every time I listen to these presentations, and certainly it takes you back to the time when I was going through the preparation process, as I would imagine many people here who have done the preparation process. Some things sound familiar, and some things have changed greatly. We thank you, Tim, for being with us and for sharing with us. Again, I know that in the Office of the General Assembly, they're one of your greatest resources for questions, and your polity questions and the very practical questions that I'm sure you're faced with every day. So join me in thanking Tim, and we just want to thank you for giving us of your time today. And this recording will be available to be shared with your CPMs, and it will be posted as soon as possible. We are working toward in 2022 of hosting a COM and a CPM training that will be Senate-wide. And we'll be talking with Tim and others from the Office of the General Assembly and figuring out what's the most practical way to do this. But we know the importance of you having opportunities to meet your national staff persons, to make those connections, and to meet your other colleagues within the Senate as they're looking at ways that they are working with those who are in the preparation process. The more we can collaborate and share information, the better we will be as a Senate in addressing the needs of those who are discerning vocational ministry. So Tim, thank you. Thank you very much. I thought there was one hand. Was that an applause? Okay, it was an applause. Thank you so much again, Lori. Thank you for your work. Blessings and peace, everyone. Have a wonderful holiday, and we look forward to sharing more information with you in the future. Goodbye.